It was almost midnight when the sound of frantic knocking shattered the silence of the house. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a stray animal, but the urgency in that desperate rhythm made my blood run cold. I opened the door, and what I saw made my heart stop. A woman, trembling, soaked from the rain, her arms barely covering the bruises that painted her body in shades of purple and yellow, eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. She collapsed into my arms, whispering incoherently, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't even move. Something inside me knew this wasn't a random accident or a simple argument gone wrong. It was years of hidden pain finally spilling into the open. As I held her, the truth started to emerge, a terrifying story of abuse, betrayal, and secrets her husband had been hiding for years. A life that seemed perfect to everyone else, but was in reality a nightmare behind closed doors. Tonight you will hear how a single knock at the door revealed a truth that shattered everyone who thought they knew her story, a journey through fear, courage, and the strength it takes to stand up against a life built on lies, and how one woman's survival changed everything forever. It was nearly midnight, and the house was wrapped in a silence that felt almost sacred, the kind that makes even the smallest sound echo like a warning. I was sitting on the couch, sipping my tea, when a sharp, frantic knock ripped through the quiet. My first instinct was disbelief. Who could be out at this hour, pounding on my door with such desperation? I froze, my heart skipping a beat, a shiver crawling down my spine. The knock came again, louder, more urgent, as if someone was running out of time, as if every second counted. I dropped my cup and moved toward the door cautiously, my mind racing with questions, fear creeping into my chest. When I opened the door, what I saw made my knees buckle before I even had a chance to react. There she was, a woman I had known only as a neighbor, a friend, someone whose life always seemed orderly and perfect from the outside. But the perfect illusion was gone. She was drenched from the rain, her clothes clinging to her trembling body, and her face was swollen and marked by deep bruises, the purple and yellow patches standing out against pale skin. Her eyes were wide with terror, darting around as if expecting someone to jump out and hurt her again. I barely had time to react before she stumbled forward, collapsing into my arms. Her weight pressed down like a storm, and I felt the reality of her suffering immediately, raw, painful, undeniable. She whispered something incoherent, her lips trembling, and I instinctively held her tighter, afraid to let go, afraid that if I did, she would vanish into the night, swallowed by fear and rain. As she clung to me, fragments of her story began to slip out in whispers. Her voice was barely audible, broken by sobs and trembling breaths. "Please, I can't," she stammered, and then fell silent again, burying her face in my chest. I felt her body shaking violently, the fear radiating from her in waves, and I realized this was not a random accident or a wartime fight. Years of pain, of abuse and control had finally culminated in this single desperate moment. My mind spun with questions. What had happened? Who could have done this to her? How could someone I thought I knew be capable of such cruelty? But before I could even process these thoughts, she gasped and whispered the first chilling detail. The man she had trusted the most, the man she had married, the one she called her husband, was the source of this horror. I led her inside carefully, making sure she didn't stumble on the wet floor. Every step revealed more of her injuries, a deep bruise on her cheek, swelling around her eyes, marks on her arms and hands that looked like defensive wounds. It was clear she had been trying to protect herself from blows, trying to survive an attack she couldn't fight off. I helped her to the couch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and tried to make her feel safe, though even I knew words were powerless against the terror etched into her every movement. Her breathing was uneven, her entire body taut with fear, as if she were ready to flee at the slightest noise. I tried to speak softly, coaxing her to explain, to tell me what had happened. Slowly, almost painfully, she began to speak, each word carrying the weight of years of fear and suffering. She told me about the life she had been living behind closed doors, a life that no one could have imagined from the outside. The husband everyone admired, the man who smiled politely at neighbours and hosted gatherings with a charming demeanour, was not the man she lived with at home. Behind locked doors, he was controlling, violent, manipulative, and cruel. She recounted the slow erosion of her freedom, how small criticisms turned into emotional torture, how demands for obedience escalated into physical abuse, and how every attempt to reach out for help was met with threats, intimidation, and lies. Each sentence she spoke cut deeper than the bruises I could see. I felt a mix of horror, anger, and helplessness, but most of all, I felt the undeniable reality of her suffering, a reality no one else had seen, because no one else had been allowed to see. She described the turning point, the night she could no longer endure the abuse. Her husband had grown more unpredictable, more dangerous, and that night, after an argument, he had struck her repeatedly, leaving marks that told a story far worse than she had ever imagined sharing. She had tried to escape, only to find herself cornered, trapped in fear, unsure who to trust, until finally she ran, running through the rain, running for her life, until she reached my door. That frantic knock, that desperate plea for help, was the culmination of years of pain, fear, and suffering that she could no longer hide. As I listened, my chest tightened. I realized that this story was not just about one act of violence, it was a pattern, a life built on fear, control, and lies. And yet, despite the terror, despite the injuries, there was something in her voice, a spark of courage, a will to survive that had driven her to this moment. She had chosen life, chosen to reveal the truth, and in that act, she had begun to reclaim her power. I felt a surge of protective instinct, a need to do everything in my power to ensure her safety. That night marked the beginning of a journey into the dark secrets that had been hidden, a journey into uncovering the truth behind the man everyone thought they knew, and a journey into helping a woman find her strength and freedom. The knock at the door had shattered the illusion of safety, not just for her, but for everyone around her. It was a single moment that would set off a chain of events, revealing betrayal, exposing secrets, and ultimately testing the limits of courage, love, and justice. As I sat there holding her trembling body, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The fear in her eyes told me that her story needed to be heard, that justice needed to be served, and that the truth she carried could no longer be hidden. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside, chaotic, relentless, and unavoidable. And in that quiet, terrifying moment, I made a silent promise I would stand by her. I would help her face the darkness, and together we would uncover the truth that had been buried for far too long. The morning light had barely begun to creep through the curtains, but inside the house, time felt suspended, as if the night's terror had stretched on for days. She was still trembling on the couch, wrapped in the blanket I had offered, her body racked with quiet sobs. Each bruise on her skin seemed to tell a story of control, of fear, of suffering that had been carefully hidden from the world. I could trace the dark purple marks along her arms and shoulders, each one telling of a struggle to survive, a desperate attempt to fight back. Her cheek was swollen. One eye half shut from the blows she had endured, and yet she tried to speak, trying to explain. Though every word was broken and halting, I sat beside her quietly, not wanting to rush her, knowing that forcing her to talk could push her back into the panic that had driven her here. Slowly, she began to recount the sequence of events that had led to this moment, how small things at first seemed harmless, but eventually became part of a relentless cycle of abuse. She spoke of the early months of her marriage, when everything appeared perfect. He was charming, attentive, even affectionate at times, and the life he projected to the outside world seemed like a dream. Friends and family praised him for being devoted and polite. A man who could do no wrong, but behind closed doors. The reality was entirely different. The first bruise, she said, had been almost accidental. He had been angry about something minor, a misplaced document, a missed call, and his hand had struck her shoulder during an argument. She hadn't told anyone, hoping it was a one-time lapse. A momentary explosion that would never happen again, but it didn't stop. Each incident escalated. Harsh words became shouts, shouts became intimidation, intimidation became strikes. Sometimes it was her arms and shoulders, sometimes her back or her ribs. She tried to shield herself, but his strength and rage were overwhelming. She described the long nights of fear, waiting for him to return home, not knowing what mood would greet her, wondering if she would survive another night. Her hands shook as she showed me the defensive wounds, red marks along her wrists, scabs on her knuckles from trying to push him away. I never wanted to fight back, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I only wanted to survive. Each bruise was a memory, each scar a testament to the violence she had endured silently, fearing that revealing the truth would make things worse. I could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that hadn't dissipated despite having fled her home and reached safety. The world had taught her to hide, to pretend, to obey. And now she was finally confronting the consequences of years of suppression. I called a nurse and arranged for her to receive immediate medical attention. As she was gently examined, I watched her noting the hidden details that spoke volumes. The lingering swelling under one eye, the raised bruise on her upper arm, the faint discoloration along her torso. That suggested repeated hits over time. Each injury was not just a mark of physical harm, but evidence of the psychological terror that accompanied it. She flinched at the slightest touch, her body stiffening as if bracing for another attack that would never come. I realized then that the trauma was deeper than the visible wounds. The fear had etched itself into her very being, making every movement cautious, every glance tentative, every breath a careful negotiation with the memory of pain. While she underwent treatment, she began to tell me about the manipulations that had kept her trapped. He isolated her from friends, from family, from anyone who might notice the signs of abuse. He controlled finances, monitored her calls and messages, and used verbal assaults to break her confidence. He made me feel like I was worthless, like I deserved the pain, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Even when I tried to stand up, he made me doubt myself, convinced me that no one would believe me. Her words painted a picture of a life carefully controlled. A web of psychological abuse that made leaving feel impossible. Each bruise, each mark, each night of fear was tied to a larger pattern, a deliberate campaign to dominate her life. Completely. As she spoke, I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and helplessness. How could someone so outwardly respected inflict such harm? How could a person create a life of terror while maintaining a facade of normalcy for everyone else? I realized that her escape, her knock at my door, was not just a plea for immediate safety, it was a desperate bid to reclaim her life. The significance of that moment hit me fully. She had chosen to break the cycle, to face the unknown, to risk everything for the chance to survive. Hours passed and she continued to recount the small details of her suffering. The nights he refused to let her sleep, the times he humiliated her in front of others, the moments she had tried to reach out to someone, anyone, only to be silenced with threats. Her narrative was a mixture of pain, resilience, and quiet fury. It became clear that each bruise was a chapter of her story, and that the pattern of abuse had been meticulously hidden, layered under years of deception. Finally, she paused, exhausted, and I realized that listening was not enough. Action was necessary. The evidence was visible, the fear was real, and the abuse was ongoing. I reassured her, holding her hand, telling her that what had happened was not her fault, that she had survived against incredible odds, and that I would stand with her as she faced the difficult path ahead. In that moment, she allowed herself to relax slightly, leaning against me with a trust that she hadn't offered anyone in years. That day marked the beginning of a journey, one that would expose the horrifying truth her husband had hidden for so long, one that would force her to confront the past, and one that would challenge the courage of everyone involved. The bruises on her skin were just the beginning. The emotional scars, the secrets, and the lies were yet to be revealed. But for the first time in a long time, she was no longer alone. And as I looked at her, bruised but unbroken, I understood the depth of her strength, the gravity of her suffering, and the long, painful path that lay ahead for both truth and justice. Even as the bruises were being tended to and the fear slowly ebbed from her body, her story began to reveal a deeper, more disturbing reality. A marriage that looked perfect to the world, but was in truth a carefully constructed nightmare. From the outside, people saw a happy couple, the smiling wife, elegant and polite, and the husband, charming, successful, and attentive at gatherings. Family friends often commented on how lucky she was, how devoted he seemed, how nothing could have prepared anyone for the horror she endured behind closed doors. But the truth was hidden beneath layers of manipulation, deceit, and control. Each smile she had forced, each gesture of politeness she had displayed, was a mask worn to survive, a mask that had fooled everyone for years. She described the early months of the marriage with a wistful tone, as though recalling a time that never really existed. He had been attentive at first, almost obsessively so, helping with household chores, complimenting her appearance, showering her with gifts. She had believed, like many do in the beginning, that love would carry them through challenges. The outside world had praised him as the perfect husband, the kind of man every woman dreams of. But behind the doors of their home, the subtle cracks had already begun to appear. Comments about what she wore, who she interacted with, how she spoke, all became tools of control. At first, she had brushed them off, telling herself he was just stressed, tired from work, or overly concerned about their life together. But slowly, the pattern became undeniable. Her voice shook as she recounted the first serious argument that had escalated into physical aggression. She had tried to voice her opinion on a matter, something trivial, almost laughable in hindsight, and he had snapped. The verbal abuse was swift and cutting, designed not only to hurt, but to break her confidence. Then came the push, the shove, the first bruise. She had tried to hide it, explaining it away as an accident, hoping it would never happen again, but the incident had set a precedent, a line that, once crossed, would never hold again. Each subsequent fight escalated faster, became more unpredictable, and often ended with her hiding her injuries, covering her body, and pretending all was fine when anyone else was around. She spoke about the subtle ways her independence was stripped away. He monitored her calls, questioned her about every interaction with friends, and discouraged her from pursuing hobbies or meeting family members without him present. I started to feel like I was losing myself, she whispered. Tears welling up, I didn't recognize the person I had become. I wasn't living, I was surviving. The isolation, she explained, was deliberate. By cutting her off from the people who might notice her pain or intervene, he ensured she would feel trapped, powerless and dependent on him for everything, including the illusion of safety. Even as the abuse worsened, the outside world remained deceived. He continued to host gatherings, attend family functions, and interact with neighbors with the same charm that had fooled everyone from day one. People never suspected anything. No one questioned why she avoided social events, why she seemed withdrawn, Why her smiles never quite reached her eyes, it was all part of the carefully constructed facade. A web designed to conceal the truth. And it worked, until that night, when the facade shattered with a single desperate knock on my door. Her voice cracked as she described the psychological manipulation that accompanied the physical abuse. Every insult, every threat, every act of violence was accompanied by promises, apologies, and declarations of love. He'd say he couldn't live without me, she recalled, then hit me for some imagined failure. I didn't know whether to fear him or love him, and that confusion kept me frozen, trapped in a cycle I couldn't escape. She told me how she had begun to question her own reality, doubting herself. Her memory, even her sanity. This is the hallmark of abuse, the subtle, insidious way it erodes the mind while leaving outward appearances untouched. As the morning light grew brighter, she recounted moments of hope, the rare instances when he would be gentle, when he would act like the man everyone believed him to be. Those moments were cruel in their contrast, reinforcing her belief that she could still reach him, that perhaps the man behind the violent acts was not entirely gone. Every time he smiled, every time he spoke kindly, I held onto it, she said. I believed I could fix him, that I could restore the man I fell in love with, but it was an illusion. Her words hung heavy in the room, a mixture of regret, pain, and realization. By the time she finished recounting her experiences, it was clear that this was a marriage built on deception, violence, and control. The image that everyone else had believed, the smiling husband, the perfect couple, was nothing more than a carefully curated mask. Behind closed doors, she had endured years of manipulation, fear and injury, each day eroding her self-worth and autonomy. And yet, despite everything, she had survived, clinging to the hope that she could escape, that she could reclaim her life, even if it meant confronting the man she had once trusted. That morning, sitting beside her, I understood the full gravity of her situation. The bruises were just the beginning. The real pain lay in the betrayal, the secrecy, and the years of fear that had left invisible scars on her spirit. Every story she told, every memory she recounted, revealed a life trapped in silence, a life carefully controlled by someone who had convinced the world of his innocence. And now, with the truth finally emerging, the journey to expose his lies and bring her the justice she deserved was only beginning. As the day wore on, she slowly began to regain some composure, but the weight of the revelation, the truth about the life she had lived and the man she had married, remained heavy. The next steps were clear: uncover the hidden secrets, gather proof of the abuse, and confront the reality that had been hidden behind a mask of normalcy for far too long. But even in the midst of fear and uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope. A realization that surviving the night and revealing the truth had already started to break the chains that had held her capped. 4 years. By the time the sun had fully risen, the initial panic had subsided, but the weight of years of fear and silence still hung heavily in the room. She sat quietly on the edge of the couch, wrapped tightly in the blanket I had offered, staring at the floor as if the world itself had betrayed her. The quiet was suffocating, yet necessary. It gave her the space to gather courage, to prepare herself to say what she had kept buried for so long. I sat a few feet away, offering silent support, unwilling to push, knowing that forcing words could trigger the fear she carried like a second skin. The room smelled faintly of rain and damp clothing, a reminder of the night she had run, a night that marked the turning point in her life. Finally, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes, though swollen and red from crying, held a spark that had been absent when she first knocked on my door. It was the spark of someone who had decided that silence could no longer protect her. She began to speak, her voice trembling but growing steadier with each word, as if the act of verbalizing her pain was an act of liberation. I can't hide it anymore," she whispered. "I can't live in fear, pretending everything is fine." Every day I stayed silent, I felt myself disappearing. "And now I'm done," her words struck like thunder, filling the room with a raw, undeniable truth. She began recounting the abuse in detail, piece by piece, carefully peeling away the layers of control and fear that had defined her marriage. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and suffocating. He had isolated her from family and friends, questioning every action, every word, every glance. "He would call me crazy if I questioned him," she said, voice tight with suppressed rage. "He told me no one would ever believe me. That if I ever tried to tell anyone, it would be worse." Her confession revealed the depth of his manipulation, a strategy designed not only to intimidate but to erode her very sense of self. The physical violence, she admitted, was sporadic but terrifyingly unpredictable. Sometimes it came after a minor argument, other times without warning, triggered by an imagined slight or her refusal to obey a command. She described the bruises, the scratches, the marks that told a story of survival, and the nights she lay awake, bracing for the next strike. Each recollection made it clear that the abuse was calculated, a cycle that ensured she remained trapped and terrified. Yet, despite all this, she had lived under the constant illusion that if she behaved, if she obeyed, perhaps the man she had married would return, the charming, loving figure everyone else saw. The breaking point came on a night she described with particular clarity. He had returned home later than usual, angered over a trivial issue. Words escalated into screams, and screams into violence. She had tried to defend herself, but he overpowered her easily, leaving marks that even now, hours later, were painful to look at. She had felt utterly powerless, convinced that this night could be her last if she didn't escape. "I realized," she whispered, "that I had to choose, stay and continue being destroyed, or run and risk everything to survive. That choice, terrifying and monumental, had led her to my door in the rain, shaking and bruised, but alive." As she spoke, I could see the emotional layers peeling away, revealing not just the victim she had been forced to become, but the courageous woman she still was. Every sentence was a reclaiming of power, every tear a release from years of suppression. She admitted that her silence had been her shield, the only protection she had in a life where speaking up invited danger. Yet that shield had also imprisoned her, preventing anyone from understanding the reality she faced. Now, finally, she had chosen to dismantle it. The confession wasn't easy. She paused often, sobs breaking through, shaking as memories threatened to overwhelm her. She spoke of times she had attempted to call for help, only to be silenced with threats so cruel and precise that fear became her constant companion. She spoke of nights spent hiding in closets, bathrooms, even cars, waiting for the violence to pass, and she spoke of moments when she had considered surrendering, entirely convinced that no one could or would intervene. Her words painted a picture not just of abuse, but of systematic control, fear, and psychological torment, the kind that leaves invisible scars long after the bruises fade. Even as she spoke, she acknowledged the conflicting emotions she felt. Love, fear, resentment, and hope collided within her, making every sentence heavy with complexity. "I loved him," she said softly, almost inaudibly. "I loved him because I believed the man I saw once existed. But I can no longer pretend that person is real. The man I married has always been this, controlling, violent, and manipulative. And now I see it clearly. Her honesty was disarming, a raw and unfiltered acknowledgement of truth that many never achieve." As the hours passed, her story began to clarify the extent of the deception. Her husband had presented a completely different persona to the world, one that earned admiration, trust, and even envy. No one suspected that behind the closed doors of their home, she lived in terror. The dichotomy between his public image and private actions was stark, almost unbearable in its clarity. It was a revelation that not only shed light on her suffering, but hinted at secrets that had yet to be uncovered, layers of deceit that would soon demand exposure. By the time she finished speaking, it was clear that the silence she had maintained for years had finally broken, replaced by a determination to survive, to reveal the truth, and to reclaim her life. Her words hung in the room like echoes, a mixture of fear, courage, and an undeniable demand for justice. For the first time in years she had voiced the reality of her existence, the life she had endured, the pain she had suffered, and the betrayal she had faced at the hands of the person she had once trusted above all others. Sitting there, I realized that this moment, her silence finally breaking, was pivotal. It was the beginning of a journey to uncover the full truth, confront the abuser, and bring justice to a life that had been defined by fear. Her bravery, despite the lingering trauma, was both humbling and inspiring. The path ahead would be difficult, fraught with confrontation, danger, and emotional turmoil, but for the first time, she had taken the first step toward freedom. The night she knocked on my door had not only saved her life, but had initiated a reckoning that would expose years of hidden violence, lies, and betrayal. In that quiet morning light, bruised yet resolute, terrified yet determined, she had reclaimed her voice. And in doing so, she had set in motion a journey that would challenge everything she had known about love, trust, and survival. Her silence had been her prison, but now, with every word, she began to dismantle the walls that had confined her for so long. The truth was emerging, raw and undeniable, and nothing would ever allow the shadows to conceal it again. After she had poured out her story, the room fell into a heavy silence, the kind of quiet that carries the weight of truths too long buried. Her eyes, though raw from tears, were sharper now, scanning me as if pleading for someone to truly understand the magnitude of what she had endured. And then came the revelation that shook me to the core. Her husband, the man everyone trusted, the man whose smiles and polite demeanor had fooled friends and family for years, had a life she had never known, a life shrouded in deception, manipulation, and betrayal. This was a man who could charm the world while terrorizing the one person who should have been closest to him. She began to describe the layers of secrecy that had kept her trapped, pieces of a hidden existence that she had only glimpsed in fleeting, terrifying moments. There were phone calls he would take in hushed tones, text messages he would delete immediately, and late-night outings with vague excuses. At first, she had dismissed them, hoping for explanations that never came, clinging to the idea that he loved her despite occasional odd behavior. But gradually, she realized the truth. The secrecy was deliberate, and every hidden moment contributed to a larger, darker picture. Then she told me about the first unmistakable evidence she had stumbled upon, a receipt, a message, a suspicious glance that revealed he was not the man he claimed to be. He had relationships he concealed, financial dealings she wasn't allowed to question, and activities that were both illegal and immoral. Each revelation was a gut punch, a confirmation that the life she had believed in was built on lies. She had spent years living with a man who could switch personas seamlessly, smiling for the public while planning violence and manipulation in private. Her trust had been weaponized against her, leaving her vulnerable and isolated. She recounted a particularly shocking discovery, evidence of another relationship, one that had been hidden for years. At first, she had found subtle hints, unexplained gifts, strange calls, small inconsistencies in his story. The pieces didn't make sense at the time, but as she started piecing them together, the reality emerged. He had been living a double life, maintaining a facade of a perfect marriage, while cultivating connections that betrayed every vow he had ever made. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been deceived in the most intimate, personal way imaginable. Her voice trembled as she spoke of his manipulation and control. He didn't just hide his secrets, he actively used them to keep her compliant. He threatened that anyone who tried to interfere would face consequences. He framed situations so she would appear unstable or paranoid if she dared question him. He played on her fears, her love, and her hope, convincing her that the world would side with him while she remained alone and powerless. "He made me feel insane," she said softly. And because of that, I stayed silent, thinking it was safer. Her admission revealed the true horror. Abuse wasn't only physical, it was psychological, calculated, and relentless. As she continued, the pattern became clear. He had mastered the art of duplicity, portraying kindness and devotion when it served him, and cruelty and control when it served his darker desires. Every act of abuse, every hidden relationship, every lie was part of a broader strategy to dominate and manipulate. And all the while, the world remained oblivious, fooled by his charm, unaware that behind closed doors, he ruled a life of fear and submission. She described the chilling moment when she realized she had to confront reality. The man she had trusted completely was not only abusive, but had constructed an entire secret life at her expense. The anger, betrayal, and fear collided within her, creating a storm she could no longer ignore. She knew that leaving him, exposing him, and seeking help would be dangerous, but the alternative, continuing to live in terror, was no longer acceptable. The gravity of her decision hung in the room like a storm cloud, heavy and inevitable. We began to talk about the evidence she had gathered, the messages, the receipts, the inconsistencies. It was fragmentary, but enough to paint a portrait of deception, betrayal, and control. Every detail added to the growing understanding that this was not a man who could be reasoned with. Not someone whose lies could be ignored. His secret life wasn't just morally reprehensible. It was a dangerous web that had kept her under control and had the potential to harm others. She realized that her escape was not only about survival, but about exposing the truth that had been hidden for years. As the day wore on, her recounting shifted from fear to determination. Though bruised and exhausted, she had begun to reclaim her voice, her agency, and her courage. She spoke of the steps she planned to take, the people she could trust, and the measures necessary to ensure her safety while confronting the reality of her husband's hidden life. It was a delicate balance, moving forward without provoking retaliation, revealing the truth without putting herself at further risk. In that moment, it became clear that her journey was no longer just personal, it was a reckoning. The man who had controlled, abused, and deceived her was about to face exposure, a collapse of the carefully constructed life he had hidden from the world. But with exposure came danger, tension, and uncertainty. The stakes were high, her courage had set the wheels in motion, but the path ahead was fraught with peril. By evening, she had begun to understand the magnitude of her actions. She had survived years of abuse, uncovered the terrifying truth about the man she had married, and taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life. And yet, the reality of what was to come, confrontation, legal challenges, public exposure, was daunting. She was terrified, but she was also determined. The fear that had once silenced her was giving way to resolve, and with that resolve came a strength she hadn't realized she possessed. That night, as the rain finally ceased outside, we sat in silence, the weight of the revelations settling over us. Her bruises were painful reminders of the violence she had endured, but the hidden life she had uncovered was the real horror. Every lie he had told, every secret he had maintained, every moment of control had been designed to break her spirit, but she had survived, and now, armed with knowledge, courage, and determination, She was ready to face the man whose betrayal had defined her life. The chapter of deception was only halfway revealed, but the first steps toward justice had been taken. Her silence had broken, her fear had been confronted, and the truth about the hidden life her husband had lived was now out in the open. The journey ahead would test her courage, resilience, and determination, but she had begun to reclaim her life. And in doing so, she had set the stage for a confrontation that would expose the darkness lurking behind the mask of normalcy. A confrontation that would reveal the full scope of his lies and finally deliver the justice she had long deserved. The night she finally decided to leave was the culmination of years of fear, control, and emotional torment. Even as she described it to me, her voice trembled. Recalling the terror that had gripped her every nerve, the adrenaline that had kept her alive, and the calculated bravery she had summoned from deep within. She had known for weeks that escape was the only way to survive, that remaining in the house meant continued abuse, perhaps even death. Every day had been a careful balancing act, pretending, hiding, enduring, but the night she made her decision, the weight of years of suffering became unbearable, and she knew she could no longer wait. She began planning with painstaking precision. She couldn't afford mistakes. Every step had to be calculated. She packed a small bag in secret, knowing that even a hint of preparation would alert him and trigger his wrath. Her movements were slow and deliberate, careful not to make noise, careful not to leave a trace. She had memorized the patterns of his movements, the hours when he was most volatile, and the times when he might be distracted. The fear she carried was palpable. She was terrified. Yet every ounce of fear was sharpened into determination. She had to survive. And this was her only chance. The first sign that he might notice came sooner than she expected. He entered the room suddenly, questioning why she had been up so late, his voice a low growl that made her freeze in place. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat echoing like a drum of impending doom. He didn't see the bag yet, but his suspicion was evident in his narrowed eyes and tense posture. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, to respond with the kind of obedience he had conditioned her to display for years. She answered his questions politely, softly, hiding the panic that threatened to betray her. For a moment, she feared this would be the night he would strike, the night he would discover her plan and end her attempt before it even began. Hours later, under the cover of darkness, she began her escape. She had chosen the route carefully, a back door that led to the alley, past the dimly lit street, away from prying eyes. Every step was tense, her body coiled, ready to flee or defend herself if necessary. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was focused entirely on the next step, on the possibility of freedom, on the hope that this night could mark a turning point in her life. Her heart raced with fear and anticipation, but with each step she took away from the house, the realization of what she was doing began to sink in. She was finally leaving, and there was no turning back. But leaving was not simple. Halfway down the alley, she heard him calling her name, his voice sharp and accusing, demanding to know where she was going. Panic surged through her veins. She ran faster, her bag clutched tightly, her mind focusing on nothing but survival. The adrenaline coursed through her body, sharpening her senses, making her hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every possible threat. She knew he could follow, knew he could catch her if she faltered. And she refused to give him the satisfaction of control. Every step forward was an act of defiance, an act of courage, and a desperate grasp at freedom. Her escape was not without risk. The neighborhood was quiet but not empty, and the fear of being seen, followed, or intercepted made every movement tense and calculated. She ducked into shadows, paused behind walls, and moved silently across streets, each second stretching into eternity. She recalled later how every sound seemed amplified: a car door slamming, footsteps echoing, the distant bark of a dog, all sending jolts of terror through her, yet despite the fear, despite the exhaustion and bruises, she pressed on. She could not stop, could not falter. Because stopping meant being trapped again, and she had tasted the possibility of freedom. Finally, drenched from a light rain and trembling from exhaustion, she reached a familiar street, a street that led to a house she trusted, my door. She had memorized my address in the weeks prior. Having decided that if she survived the night, this was where she would go, where she could finally find help. As she approached, the reality of her situation hit her with full force. She was finally free, but only if she could reach safety. Every step forward was a battle between fear and hope. But her determination outweighed the terror that had paralyzed her for so long. She knocked on the door, her hand shaking violently, soaked from the rain, bruised from the struggle, and exhausted from months of hiding, enduring, and planning. The knock echoed through the silence, frantic, desperate, pleading, when the door opened. She collapsed into my arms, the culmination of a night filled with fear, strategy, and courage. In that moment, the weight of years of abuse, the fear of immediate danger, and the uncertainty of survival pressed down on her, yet she had made it. She had escaped. As she told me about the night later, I realized the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Escaping was not just about fleeing, it was about confronting fear that had been instilled over years, about acting despite terror, and about reclaiming a life that had been stolen. Each bruise she bore was a mark of survival, each step a testament to her courage. The night she ran had been terrifying, exhausting, and uncertain, but it had also been transformative, the first real act of agency she had taken in years. Her story of that night revealed not only the physical dangers she faced, but the psychological manipulation that had kept her compliant. Every action, every pause, every calculated movement was informed by years of conditioning, fear, and the need to survive. Yet, even in the midst of terror, she had found strength, a strength that would carry her forward in the days, weeks, and months to come. That night marked the pivotal moment in her journey. It was the night she chose life over fear, courage over submission, and freedom over captivity. And as she collapsed at my door, trembling, bruised and soaked from the rain, I knew that the path forward would be difficult, dangerous, and filled with confrontation. But the most important battle had been won. She had survived the night, and she had taken the first definitive step toward reclaiming her life. The days following her escape were tense, filled with a fragile mixture of relief and looming danger. She had survived the night, but the reality of what awaited her, the inevitable confrontation with the man who had tormented her for years, loomed like a storm cloud over every thought. She knew he would discover her absence eventually, and when he did, the consequences could be unpredictable, violent, and terrifying. Every plan had to be precise, every action calculated. The stakes had never been higher. She was not just escaping her past, she was stepping into a battle for her future. I helped her make arrangements to document everything, photographs of her injuries, messages that revealed his manipulations, and details of his hidden life. Each piece of evidence was a small but powerful weapon against the man who had controlled her existence for so long. But collecting evidence was only the beginning. Eventually, she would have to confront him, to assert her newfound autonomy, and face the lies he had built around their life. The thought of seeing him again terrified her, but she understood it was a necessary step, not just for justice, but for closure. The confrontation came sooner than expected. He arrived at my neighborhood, frantic and suspicious, trying to locate her. His eyes scanned the street with a mix of anger and desperation. Unaware that she had anticipated this move and prepared accordingly, when she saw him approaching, Her pulse raced, her body tense with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. But beneath the fear was determination, a determination she had cultivated over weeks of planning, hiding, and surviving. She would no longer be a passive victim, she would face him. And she would stand her ground. As he arrived at the door, she stood firmly beside me. Bruised but unbroken, her voice steady despite the tremor of underlying fear. He demanded to know where she had gone, why she had left, and who had helped her. His tone was menacing, his charm gone, replaced by raw anger and disbelief. He could not comprehend that the woman he had tried to control for years had escaped his grasp. Each demand, each accusation, was met with calm, precise responses, carefully crafted to maintain safety while asserting her autonomy. "I'm leaving," she said clearly, her voice unwavering. "I will not live under your control any longer. I will not endure your abuse. Everything you've done is coming to light. And I will not be afraid anymore." Her words were a declaration. A boundary that could not be crossed. For the first time, she was not pleading, not hiding, not apologizing. She was confronting the man she had once trusted and exposing the truth that had been buried for years. His reaction was a mix of disbelief, rage, and panic. He could not reconcile the image of the obedient, controlled wife with the woman standing before him, bruised, exhausted, yet fiercely resolute. He tried to manipulate, to charm, to threaten, but each attempt faltered against her newfound strength. Every lie he had relied upon to maintain control was crumbling, every mask he had worn for the world slipping away. For the first time, he faced the consequences of the cruelty he had inflicted. As tensions escalated, she produced evidence she had collected, photographs, messages, and records of his secret life and manipulations. Each piece of evidence was a strike against the control he had exerted over her. The reality of exposure, legal consequences, and social accountability began to dawn on him. His anger surged, but it was no longer a weapon against compliance. It was a reaction to the unraveling of a life built on deception. She held her ground, standing firm despite the fear that still lingered beneath the surface. The confrontation was not only external, it was internal. She had to manage her fear, her adrenaline, and the memories of years of abuse while asserting her position. Every word, every movement, every choice had consequences. Yet, even in the face of potential danger, she displayed courage that was born of survival. The woman who had once hidden from violence in closets and behind locked doors now faced the source of her suffering openly. Her presence was a statement that she had survived, that she would not be silenced, and that justice was inevitable. Witnessing the confrontation, I realized that this moment was pivotal. It was not just about fear or control, it was about reclaiming identity, asserting agency, and dismantling a carefully constructed facade of dominance. The husband, once confident in his control, was now confronted with the undeniable reality of the consequences he had ignored for years. The balance of power had shifted, and the woman he sought to dominate was no longer compliant. She was visible, vocal, and prepared to defend herself against a lifetime of deception. By the end of the confrontation, the man retreated, shaken and aware that his control had been broken. Though the fear of retaliation remained, she had established the truth of her survival and exposed the lies that had defined their marriage. The confrontation was not merely about words or evidence, it was a reclaiming of her life, a refusal to be silenced, and the first real step toward lasting freedom. That night, after he had left, she sat quietly, processing the intensity of the confrontation. Relief, fear, and empowerment mingled in her chest. She had faced the man who had defined her life with fear and manipulation, and she had emerged unbroken. The path ahead remained fraught with challenges, legal battles, emotional recovery, and confronting the social consequences of exposure, but for the first time, She was no longer a prisoner of his power. The confrontation had shifted everything, proving to her that survival was not only possible but within her control. In the quiet aftermath, she realized the significance of this victory. The confrontation was a turning point, the moment when fear no longer dictated her actions, the moment when her strength became undeniable, and the moment when the truth she had carried for so long was finally recognized. Though the scars, bruises, and memories remained, she had reclaimed the agency that had been denied to her for years. She had stood up, faced her abuser, and emerged as someone unafraid to confront the darkness that had overshadowed her life. The morning after the confrontation, a fragile sense of calm settled over her, but the reality was clear. Surviving the night and facing him was only the beginning. The path ahead was far more complex, filled with legal hurdles, societal judgment, and the emotional labor of recounting her trauma over and over. She knew that to truly reclaim her life, she had to seek justice, not just for herself, but for the years of abuse she had endured in silence. This was no longer about escape, it was about accountability. The first step was to report the abuse formally. She met with a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases, someone who could guide her through the maze of legal documentation, evidence collection, and court proceedings. Sitting across from the lawyer, she recounted every detail of the abuse, every bruise, every threat, every instance of manipulation and control. Speaking about it aloud for the first time in years was exhausting. But it also had a liberating effect. Her story was being validated, transformed from a private nightmare into actionable truth. The lawyer's calm, empathetic responses reassured her that she was no longer alone, and that the system, though slow and challenging, could offer protection and accountability. Collecting evidence became a daily routine, photographs of her injuries, screenshots of incriminating messages, recordings of threatening phone calls, and written journals documenting years of abuse all became part of the legal arsenal. She meticulously catalogued each piece, understanding that the process of seeking justice required precision, persistence, and courage. Every photo of a bruise, every documented threat, was a silent witness to the years she had suffered, proof that the violence was real, systematic, and deliberate. With each piece of evidence, her confidence grew, and the fear that had defined her life began to weaken. At the same time, she reached out to support networks, organizations, shelters, and advocacy groups that helped survivors of domestic abuse. There, she found a community of people who had endured similar horrors and emerged stronger. Listening to their stories, she realized she was not alone, that survival was possible, and that justice could be pursued even against abusers who had carefully concealed their crimes. The solidarity she found was empowering. It reinforced the belief that her voice mattered, that her story could not only bring accountability, but also inspire others to escape cycles of abuse. The husband, aware that she had taken steps to seek justice, began to escalate his intimidation. Messages filled with anger and veiled threats arrived at odd hours. He attempted to contact her friends, neighbors, and even family members, trying to create doubt, confusion, and fear. But she had anticipated this. She documented every attempt, blocked communication, and ensured that every move he made was traceable. The control he had wielded for years was slipping, and he was grasping at anything to regain it. Yet, for the first time, his power over her was not absolute. The tables had turned, and the law, as slow and imperfect as it could be, was on her side. The legal process itself was grueling, filing restraining orders, attending preliminary hearings, and submitting evidence in court required immense emotional stamina. She relived moments of trauma, repeatedly answering questions that probed her fear, doubt, and pain. Each session was a battle between vulnerability and strength, yet each small victory, a restraining order granted, a court date scheduled, a testimony recorded, reinforced her sense of agency. She was no longer a passive victim, she was an active participant in dismantling the life of control and abuse that had haunted her. As news of the case slowly spread among mutual acquaintances, reactions were mixed. Some were shocked, others sympathetic, and a few skeptical, unable or unwilling to reconcile the man they had admired with the monster she had described. Navigating these reactions was another challenge, as she had to maintain focus on the legal process while shielding herself from judgment and disbelief. She realized that justice was not only about the law, but also about reclaiming her reputation and ensuring that the truth was recognized in every circle where she had once been silenced. Throughout the process, she drew strength from small victories, a supportive judge, an empathetic investigator, and the growing network of people who believed her. These victories reminded her that the fight was not only for punishment, but for restoration of safety, dignity, and the right to live free from fear. She began to plan a life beyond survival, imagining a future where she could rebuild, pursue dreams, and reclaim moments stolen by years of abuse. Each step forward was an act of defiance against the man who had tried to control her, and an affirmation of her own resilience. The emotional toll, however, remained heavy. Nights were sleepless, haunted by memories of the abuse and anxiety about the confrontations to come. There were moments of doubt, when fear threatened to overwhelm, and the weight of the past seemed too great to bear. But in those moments, she reminded herself of the choice she had made, to live, to fight, to assert her right to justice, every document filed, every meeting attended, and every court session endured was a testament to her strength and determination. By the end of this chapter of her journey, she had taken a crucial step toward reclaiming her life. Justice was no longer a distant hope, it was an active process, demanding courage, persistence, and unwavering resolve. The path ahead would remain difficult, filled with legal battles, emotional recovery, and confrontation. But she had begun to transform her survival into empowerment. The woman who had once knocked on my door, bruised, terrified, and silenced, was now an agent of her own destiny, wielding truth and evidence as her shields and weapons. The pursuit of justice became more than a legal endeavor, it was a reclaiming of identity, power, and freedom. Each step forward diminished the fear that had once governed her life, replacing it with resolve and courage. Though the journey was far from over, she had already proven that survival was not enough. She would not only live, but she would also ensure that the truth was known, the lies were exposed, and the man who had sought to dominate her for years would face the consequences of his actions. The day of the final confrontation arrived with an almost unbearable tension. Months of planning, fear, and preparation had led to this moment, the moment when truth, courage, and justice would collide with lies, manipulation, and control. She had meticulously gathered every piece of evidence, worked with legal counsel, and prepared herself mentally and emotionally for what was to come. Yet nothing could fully erase the anxiety, the gnawing fear that the man who had terrorized her for years might attempt one last act of intimidation. Arriving at the courthouse, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the racing heartbeat, and the weight of anticipation. Every step forward was both terrifying and empowering. For the first time in years, she was facing the man who had controlled, manipulated, and abused her, not in secret, not behind closed doors, but in a space where law, order, and truth would have authority over fear. Her bruises were mostly healed, but her spirit still bore scars that no one could see. And yet, she carried herself with the determination of someone who had survived the impossible and was now prepared to reclaim her life fully. The first sight of him in the courtroom struck her with a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. He appeared composed, calm, even confident, as if the months of evidence and exposure were inconsequential, but the confidence was thin, brittle, and unsustainable. His mask, which had fooled friends, family, and acquaintances for years, could not withstand the scrutiny of legal proceedings, the weight of documented proof, and the relentless determination of a woman no longer willing to be silenced. The hearing began. With formalities, but the tension was palpable. She took her seat, hands trembling slightly, and watched as the proceedings unfolded. Each piece of evidence was presented: the photographs of injuries, the messages revealing manipulation, the testimony of witnesses who had seen hints of his abusive behavior, and the detailed logs she had kept documenting years of abuse. Every detail painted a vivid picture of a man who had controlled, deceived, and terrorized the woman sitting before the court. When her turn to speak arrived, she stood, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on her, speaking clearly, with a voice that wavered only slightly from the weight of emotion. She recounted her story, not as a victim pleading for pity, but as a survivor asserting her truth. She spoke of fear, manipulation, and violence, of nights spent hiding and days spent enduring a carefully constructed nightmare. She spoke of courage, determination, and survival, of the steps she had taken to reclaim her life and expose the truth. Every word was deliberate, every sentence a strike against years of deception. The husband's reaction was a mixture of anger, denial, and desperation. He attempted to interject, to cast doubt, to manipulate the narrative in his favor, but the evidence was overwhelming. The truth he had worked so hard to conceal was now laid bare. Undeniable and incontestable, witness after witness corroborated her story, and every document, every photograph, every record dismantled the facade he had maintained for so long. The courtroom, a place of law and scrutiny, became the stage where his lies were stripped away and the reality of his abuse was revealed in stark clarity as the hearing progressed. The emotional weight of the proceedings was immense. She had to relive moments of trauma, confront fear, and maintain composure in the face of someone who had caused years of suffering. The process was exhausting, both mentally and physically, yet every statement, every answer, every piece of evidence reaffirmed her agency. She was no longer a passive participant in her story. She was actively shaping its outcome, transforming survival into justice. The climax of the confrontation came when the judge addressed both parties, acknowledging the severity of the abuse and the compelling evidence presented. The husband, once confident and controlling, now sat in silence, his demeanor shifting from defiance to apprehension. For the first time, he was faced with accountability, forced to confront the consequences of actions that had long been hidden behind charm, deception, and fear. The courtroom was a crucible where truth, courage, and justice converged, and he could no longer control the narrative. After hours of testimony, cross-examination, and presentation of evidence, the verdict was clear. Restraining orders were extended, legal accountability was established, and the husband was confronted with the full weight of the law. It was not the end of the battle, but it was a monumental step, a public acknowledgement that the abuse had been real, deliberate, and harmful, and that the woman who had suffered for years would finally be protected and empowered. As she left the courthouse, a wave of relief and empowerment washed over her. Months of fear, planning, and emotional struggle had culminated in a decisive confrontation. She had faced the man who had tried to control her, stood her ground, and ensured that justice was set in motion. The journey was far from over. Legal processes, emotional recovery, and social repercussions remained. But she had achieved something monumental. She had transformed fear into courage, silence into voice, and survival into empowerment. That night, She reflected on the magnitude of what had transpired. She realized that the confrontation had been more than a legal victory. It had been an assertion of self, a reclaiming of identity, and a powerful declaration that she would no longer be controlled by fear or deception. The scars, bruises, and memories of abuse remained, but they were now marks of survival, resilience, and strength. The final showdown had not just exposed the truth, it had transformed her. She had faced the abuser, confronted the lies, and ensured that justice would be pursued. Fear no longer dictated her actions, courage did, silence no longer bound her, voice did. And for the first time in years, she could see a future defined not by trauma and control, but by empowerment, resilience, and the promise of a life reclaimed. The days following the final confrontation were quiet in comparison to the storm she had endured, yet they carried their own intensity. She had faced him, reclaimed her voice, and ensured that justice had been set in motion. But now came a new challenge, moving forward, rebuilding a life that had been defined for years by fear, manipulation, and abuse. She understood that survival was only the beginning. True freedom required healing, courage, and a willingness to embrace the future, however uncertain it might be. The first step in moving forward was reclaiming her personal space. The house she had once fled was no longer hers, yet the memory of every corridor, every door, every locked closet carried echoes of control. She had to detach from the physical reminders of her past life and create a space where she could feel safe, where the past could no longer reach her. With help from friends, advocates, and legal advisors, she found a temporary refuge, a place where she could sleep without fear, eat without stress, and breathe without constant vigilance. Every small comfort, from locking the door behind her to the simple act of walking freely, became an affirmation of her regained autonomy. Emotional recovery, however, proved more complicated. Years of abuse had left deep scars, both visible and invisible. Nights were filled with restless sleep, haunted by memories of violence and manipulation. Triggers appeared in unexpected moments, a raised voice, a sudden movement, or even a shadow passing by, each sparking an echo of past fear. She worked tirelessly with a therapist, recounting her story in safe spaces, learning strategies to manage anxiety, and slowly reshaping her relationship with the world around her. With each session, each conversation, she chipped away at the layers of fear, reclaiming parts of herself that had been buried beneath trauma. Support networks became a cornerstone of her recovery. Friends, family, and advocacy groups provided both practical assistance and emotional reassurance. She realized the importance of community, of being seen and believed, of knowing that she was not alone in her journey. Listening to other survivors, sharing experiences, and offering mutual encouragement reinforced the truth she had fought to assert in court. She was worthy of safety, respect, and dignity. Every conversation, every shared story, became a brick in the foundation of her renewed life. Legal protections remained in place, but their existence carried weight beyond the courtroom. Restraining orders, monitoring of his activities, and ongoing documentation ensured that she had a shield against future threats. The knowledge that the law recognized her suffering and supported her autonomy became both a comfort and a source of empowerment. She understood that accountability was not just punitive, it was protective, a tool to ensure her future would be free from the fear that had once dominated every day. As weeks turned into months, she began to explore opportunities that had been impossible while living under his control. Hobbies she had abandoned, friendships she had neglected, and career aspirations she had suppressed slowly returned. Every small step, enrolling in a class, reconnecting with a friend, even laughing without fear, became a triumph. The process was gradual, but each victory reinforced her agency, her resilience, and her capacity to create a life unshackled by the trauma of the past. The emotional resolution also required confronting lingering anger and grief. She mourned the years lost, the trust betrayed, and the life she might have had. But alongside grief, there was empowerment. She had faced the abuser, documented his lies, sought justice, and reclaimed her voice. She had survived the impossible, and now she had the tools to shape her own destiny. Anger became motivation, grief became reflection, and the past became a teacher rather than a prison. One evening, sitting by the window in her new home, she reflected on her journey. The storm of fear, abuse, and manipulation had passed, leaving behind clarity, resilience, and hope. She had transformed from a woman silenced by fear into someone who could speak, act, and assert control over her life. The scars on her body and the memories in her mind were reminders of the battles fought and won, of the courage summoned when every instinct screamed to hide. She had reclaimed herself, body, mind, and spirit, and nothing could take that away. Her journey forward was not just about survival, it was about living fully, with intention, joy, and courage. She began planning for the future, long-delayed dreams, ambitions, and relationships she had once believed were impossible. Each choice she made, from work to friendships, reflected a conscious decision to prioritize safety, growth, and self-respect. Her life was no longer dictated by fear, it was guided by resilience, purpose, and the knowledge that she had overcome unimaginable challenges. Finally, there was a sense of closure. The man who had controlled her, deceived her, and inflicted harm was no longer a looming presence. Legal protections, public exposure of his hidden life, and her own courage had dismantled the power he once held over her. She could walk freely, speak openly, and embrace a life shaped by choice rather than coercion. The emotional weight of the past would linger, but it no longer defined her. She had emerged, bruised yet unbroken, scarred yet strong, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In that quiet evening, she realized that moving forward was not just an act of self-preservation, but a declaration of life itself. She had faced the darkness, survived the night, confronted the lies, and sought justice with unwavering courage. Now she could look toward the future with hope, strength, and confidence. The journey had been harrowing, but it had transformed her, leaving her not as a victim, but as a survivor, a warrior, and a woman who would never again allow fear to dictate the terms of her life. The emotional resolution was complete, not in the absence of struggle, but in the presence of empowerment. She had reclaimed her voice, her life, and her dignity. The bruises healed, the fear subsided, and the light of a new beginning shone brightly on the horizon. She had survived the impossible, faced the truth, and emerged stronger than ever. And in that emergence, she found not just freedom, but the profound realization that the future, no longer shadowed by abuse, belonged entirely to her. As the camera lingers on her face, a mixture of relief, strength, and quiet triumph, her voice breaks the silence. I survived, not because someone saved me, but because I found the courage to save myself. The fear, the pain, the years of silence, they are behind me now. And if my story can help even one person find strength to speak, to escape, to survive, then sharing it was worth every tear. The screen shows slow-motion shots of her walking freely. Sunlight streaming through a window, a subtle smile of hope and determination on her face. Her bruises have faded, but the scars remain, a testament to resilience, courage, and survival. To anyone out there who feels trapped, silenced, or afraid, you are not alone. There is hope, and there is a way forward. Speak, seek help, and never forget your worth. The camera slowly zooms out as she looks into the horizon, symbolizing the new chapter of her life. The narrator's voice adds, "Her journey reminds us that even after the darkest nights, the light of courage can shine brighter than ever." Justice may take time, but survival, strength, and hope are yours to claim today. Finally, the screen fades to a soft overlay with the text, "If her story inspired you, support others who are finding their courage. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of survival, resilience, and hope. Hit the bell icon to never miss a story that could change a life."